Klingon bastard! Kill my son! Klingon bastard! So here we are with the movie review of Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, or as I like to call it, Star Trek III, The Wrath of Khan, Part 2. And this is the first of the odd-numbered Star Treks, and this is kind of what started the curse of all the odd-numbered Star Treks are utter crap, and all the even ones are good. That's not to say that Star Trek III doesn't have some merits, and that's not to say that it doesn't have problems, because it does have problems. And I think the biggest problem that Star Trek III has is that it doesn't feel like its own movie. It feels like what it is. And what it is they're trying to wrap up all of the events of Wrath of Khan. And they're trying to rectify a mistake that they made at the end of Khan, which is the death of Spock. One of the things that makes this movie probably not as appealing to the fans is the lack of Leonard Nimoy. Leonard Nimoy is not in this movie. He is in the movie for 5 minutes at the end of the movie when he's finally resurrected on Vulcan, and I believe he has one line, and that one line would be, "Jim, your name is Jim." And that's his contribution to the movie. He's in it for 5 minutes. That's his on-screen contribution. Leonard Nimoy directed this movie. He was the first Star Trek cast to get behind the helm and direct a feature film. So, while he did not contribute to the story, he directed the movie. And I think direction-wise, it was a good... He did well. And he did a good job. And so I think a lot of the reason why people don't like this particular movie is that this is the first time that the triumvirate of Kirk, McCoy, and Spock aren't there. This is a movie where Bill Shatner really has to carry the movie alone without Leonard Nimoy. And, you know, he doesn't really bring his A game to the table in this movie. That's not to say that it's not good. That's just to say that without Wrath of Khan, obviously, there would be no Search for Spock. And this is a movie that you really shouldn't watch on its own. If I were to put this in television terms, The Wrath of Khan would be a season finale, and The Search for Spock would be a season opener, season premiere. And I really think to appreciate fully The Search for Spock, you have to watch the two movies together, because really The Wrath of Khan and The Search for Spock are one unified whole. You can watch Wrath of Khan alone, and it's a very enjoyable and a very great movie. You can watch Search for Spock alone, and it's not that good alone, because it needs Wrath of Khan to carry it. So when I watch it, and I would recommend anybody who is watching wants to watch The Search for Spock, watch The Wrath of Khan first, and then immediately put in The Search for Spock. And I think that is a much more enjoyable movie, because there really isn't a lot of story in Search for Spock. They steal the Enterprise, they go to the Genesis planet, they bring Spock and McCoy back to Vulcan, and they resurrect him. And a couple of other things happen in the movie, but they're sort of trivial things. Kirk's son dies from the Klingons, and so, you know, he's in The Wrath of Khan, and then he gets sort of a death in this movie. Kirk blows up the Enterprise, so the Enterprise is gone. So there are some things that happen in between those points, but it's really Kirk steals the Enterprise, they go to Genesis and get Spock, they go to Vulcan and resurrect him. And it feels a little long-winded for what it is. The acting is okay. Christopher Lloyd plays a Klingon. which I enjoyed. I like seeing Christopher Lloyd in movies, and Christopher Lloyd plays the Klingon that's trying to steal the secrets of Genesis, and Kirk winds up killing him on the Genesis planet after it explodes. Kirstie Alley is not in this movie. She is replaced. Saavik is replaced by another actress who I, off the top of my head, don't know her name. I want to say her name is Robin something or other, but she plays a better Vulcan than Kirstie Alley did. Kirstie Alley did not. If there was a criticism of Wrath of Khan, for me, it would be Kirstie Alley's Saavik. Horrible casting decision. She cannot play a Vulcan. It was not good. The one that they have for this movie does a much better Saavik and a much better Vulcan. So that was a good change. But other than that, like I said, not a lot goes on in this movie, other than what they're doing. The decision to kill off Spock was Leonard Nimoy's. Leonard Nimoy didn't want to play Spock anymore. That's why they killed Spock off in Wrath of Khan, because he didn't want to play Spock anymore. He'd played it for a long time, and he wanted to go on and do other things. So they killed Spock off. And then there was a public outcry, and everybody went, you can't have a Star Trek without Spock. So they were afraid that no one was going to go watch Star Trek movies anymore, if Leonard Nimoy wasn't going to be in there. So they were afraid that they had made a mistake. So they had to come up with a contrived scenario in order to bring Spock back. Is it a contrived scenario? Yes, it is. The science is very wonky. You basically have Spock who grows from a baby to adult Spock in a matter of days. They say that he's tied to the Genesis planet, so as he ages, the Genesis planet ages, and then that's what causes the Genesis planet to eventually explode, because we find out that the Genesis planet is unstable. So it's a contrived scenario, and we're used to contrived scenarios in Star Trek. We see contrived scenarios all the time, and I am okay with a contrived scenario as long as it makes sense within the fiction. And this contrived scenario, this sort of rapid, accelerated aging of Spock, in my mind, it didn't cut it. It wasn't a good enough explanation. It seemed forced. It looked forced. It wasn't very well explained. And, that they had to do it because Spock was dead. And there was no other physical way to resurrect Spock other than the way that they did. So I understand why they did it, and they needed to do it because there was no other way to resurrect him, but it was still forced, it was still contrived, and it was still more fiction than most people would be willing to accept. So, Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, is a decent film. It's not as bad as some of the others. It's definitely was not as good as Wrath of Khan, and it was hard to follow the Wrath of Khan, and I think people recognize that. It's hard to follow that kind of storytelling, and they did the best that they could. So, for maximum watchability of Search for Spock, watch Wrath of Khan first. Don't watch Search for Spock as its own movie. Watch them together as if they were one giant mega movie, and I think that you will enjoy it more than if you were to watch Search for Spock alone. Should you watch it? Absolutely. If you're going to watch the movies, you have to, because you got to find out what happens to Spock. So if you were going to skip a movie, I would definitely not skip The Search for Spock, because if you go to the next ones, you go, hey, I thought Spock was dead. Why is he in these movies all of a sudden? So I would not recommend skipping this movie. I would also not recommend watching it on its own. I would recommend you take an afternoon and you watch the Wrath of Khan, and then you watch The Search for Spock. And I think that way you'll be able to better appreciate the movie than if you were to watch Star Trek III on its own.